Eleanor Hartwell was hanging her husband's washed uniform shirt on the line when the man from the county came up the lane with a paper. A deed transfer, Thomas Hartwell's signature on it, dated a week after his last letter said he was pinned in a shell hole near the Argonne. She didn't cry. She read it twice. Then the speculator's agent stood on her own porch. 2 hired men and the mail carrier watching. "The land's been legally sold, ma'am." Thomas signed. "You've got till Saturday to clear the house." 4 grown men, 1 widow, 1 false paper. But Thomas couldn't have signed anything that Tuesday. I had the letter proving where his hand was. And I knew one man who could still read the old land books. If you believe what's taken unjustly never stays kept, this story is for you. Subscribe and comment what city you're watching from. Eleanor Hartwell was hanging her husband's washed uniform shirt on the line when the man from the county came up the lane with a paper. She saw him before he spoke. A thin man in a town coat, walking careful, like the ground might not hold him. He had a paper in his hand. She pinned the shirt at the shoulder and let it hang. It was Thomas's Sunday shirt, not his army one. She had washed it that morning for no reason but to touch it. The paper the man carried was a deed transfer. It had Thomas's signature on it. It was dated a Tuesday, a week after the last letter said he was pinned in a shell hole near the Argonne. She read it twice. She did not cry. That was the beginning of it, though she did not know yet how long a road it would run. Let me take you back a little. Let me tell you how they came to that farm and how the ground got into their blood so you understand what it cost her to have a stranger walk up with a paper and say it was gone. The farm sat along Miller's Fork in Coshocton County, Ohio, 40 acres. Good bottomland by the water where the soil ran black and deep. The rest climbed up toward the tree line in a slow, honest grade. Thomas cleared the north field by hand the first 2 winters they were married. She remembered him coming in at dusk with his hands split at the knuckles and her packing them with lard and rag. He never complained about it. He'd say the field was worth more than his hands, and his hands would heal, and the field would still be there. They buried their first child under the elm by the fence corner. A girl. She lived 4 days. They named her after Thomas's mother and put a flat stone over her, and every spring the ground there came up green before anywhere else on the place. Eleanor never knew why. Thomas said it was the child feeding it. He said it plain, not sad, and it made her love him more than she could say. The mortgage stood at $1,140 with the Cordell County Farmers Bank. The deed was free and clear in Thomas's name. That was the shape of their life. Debt they could carry, and land they owned, and a stone under the elm, and each other. Then the war came, and Thomas enlisted. She did not fight him on it. She wanted to. She stood in the kitchen the night he told her and held on to the edge of the table so hard her knuckles ached. But she did not fight him. He was a man who'd cleared a field with his own hands because he thought it was right, and she knew that same thing in him was what sent him off to France. You cannot love a man for one and hate him for the other. So she packed his sock and his razor and a photograph of the elm, and she watched him get on the train at the depot in Coshocton, and she drove the wagon home alone in the dark. His letters came after that. They came slow and out of order, the way soldier mail did, but they came. And each one had a little postmark stamped on the envelope. Army Field Post. Dates, places she couldn't say right. She kept every one. She kept them in the flour tin. It was a tall tin with a lid, tin from the store, and she'd emptied out the flour into a crock and washed the tin clean and dried it, and that was where the letters went. Every one. She'd read a new one at the table by the lamp and read it again, and then fold it back into its envelope and set it in the tin with the others. In the evenings, when the house got too quiet, she'd take one out and read it aloud to the empty chair across from her. His chair. She read his own words back to the room in his own voice, best she could do it, and it made the house feel less like a box she was shut up in. He wrote about the mud, mostly the trench mud. He said a man could lose a boot in it and never find the boot again. He said he thought about the north field and how clean the dirt was there, how it smelled after rain, and how the French mud smelled like nothing that ought to grow anything. He said when he came home he was going to lie down in the north field and not get up till she came looking. He said tell the elm he'd be back. She read that one more than the others. So you see what the 40 acres meant. It wasn't dirt to them. It was the child under the elm and the split knuckles and the promise to lie down in the clean field when the war let him go. That's the ledger of it. That's what was on the line when the thin man came up the lane with a paper. Now, the paper. It said Thomas Hartwell had sold the farm. All 40 acres, the bottomland and the north field and the elm and the stone under it, sold to a concern called Voss and Meridian Land Company for $310. $310. For a farm worth 6 times that if it was worth a cent. She knew what the land was worth. She'd stood beside Thomas when the assessor came. $2,000, the man had said. And that was a low year. And it was dated a Tuesday. The signature on the bottom said Thomas Hartwell in a hand that leaned the right way and looped the right way. Close enough that a man who didn't know his writing would call it his. But she knew his writing. She'd read his writing by lamplight 100 nights running. More than that, she knew where his hand had been that Tuesday. She went in the house while the county man stood on the porch, and she took the flour tin down off the shelf, and she found the letter from that week. The postmark was smeared, but you could read it. Field Hospital. He wrote that a shell had come in near enough to bury 3 men beside him, and he'd caught it in the shoulder and the hand, and a nurse was writing part of the letter down for him because his own hand was wrapped and useless. He'd signed it himself at the bottom, a shaky thing, hardly his signature at all, a wounded man's scrawl. On the deed, dated the very next day near enough, the signature was clean and sure. The signature of a man with 2 good hands sitting at a desk. She stood in her own kitchen holding both papers, one in each hand, and she felt something go still and cold and clear in her chest. Not grief, not yet. Something more like the feeling before a storm, when the birds quit and the light goes green. There's a mistake here, she said to the county man when she came back out. She said it quiet. He wouldn't meet her eye. He was just the delivering man. He'd done his part. You'll want to take that up with the company, ma'am, he said. And he touched his hat and went back down the lane the way he came. She thought about the little dates on the envelopes then. She'd never once thought they'd matter. They were just the way the army stamped the mail. But standing there she understood, in a way she couldn't have put into words, that those little dates were going to matter more than anything in her life had ever mattered. She put the letters back in the tin. She put the lid on. She set it back on the shelf. And she went out and took Thomas's Sunday shirt off the line, because the wind had come up, and she folded it against her chest and stood a while. Voss and Meridian didn't wait long. 2 weeks after the county man, a wagon came up the lane with 3 men on it and a roll of wire in the back. She watched them from the porch. They didn't come to the house. They went down to the bottomland, the good bottomland along the fork. And they started driving posts and stringing wire across the pasture. Cutting it off. Her cows stood at the new fence and looked at it stupid, the way cows do. And she stood on the porch and looked at it too. And the men didn't so much as tip a hat her direction. She walked down. She wasn't going to stand on the porch and watch them fence off Thomas's ground and say nothing. The man in charge was a heavy fellow with a pocket watch he kept looking at, like the fencing was on a schedule. "This is my husband's land," she said. "Was, ma'am," he said. He didn't even look up. "Company's land now. Bought and recorded. We're just marking it." "My husband is in France," she said. "He couldn't have sold you anything." "Recorded down at the county," the man said. "All legal. You've got a complaint, take it there." And he went back to his post driving, and she stood in her own pasture like a stranger on it. She did take it to the county. She drove into Cossacton the next morning and went to the courthouse and found the land office, and there behind the counter was the clerk. Silas Pruitt. A man of about 50, soft in the middle, with ink on his fingers and a way of looking at you over the top of his spectacles that made you feel he'd already decided something about you. She laid it out. The deed, the date, her husband overseas. Pruitt listened with his head tipped, patient. The way you listen to a child explain why the broken thing wasn't their fault. The transfers recorded, Mrs. Hartwell, he said, when she was done. Entered in the book. I entered it myself. He said that last part like it settled the matter. Like his own hand in the book was the same as the truth. The deed is filed. It's legal. I don't know what to tell you. My husband was wounded that week, she said. I have his letter. His hand was broken. He couldn't hold a pen. Pruitt took his spectacles off and cleaned them on his sleeve. A letter's a letter, ma'am, he said. A recorded deed is a recorded deed. The one carries weight at law, the other's a sentiment. He put the spectacles back on. Was there anything else? She held it in. She wanted to reach across that counter and take the ink-stained man by his collar, but she held it in. Because she understood already that anger was a thing this man knew how to use against her. A hysterical widow. That was a story people liked to tell. So she said nothing more, and she drove home, and the wire was still up across the bottomland when she got there. She wrote to the army after that. She wrote to the War Department and to the address the last letter carried, asking anyone who'd read it to confirm where Private Thomas Hartwell's hand had been that Tuesday. The letters went out. They'd take weeks, she knew. Weeks across the ocean and back. She sent them anyway. Then the store cut her off. She went into the general store in the village for flour and coffee and lamp oil, the way she had every month for 11 years. And she put it on the account the way she always had, and the storekeeper, a decent enough man ordinarily, wouldn't look at her. I can't carry it, Mrs. Hartwell, he said low, so the others in the store wouldn't hear. Not on the account. I've always paid the account. The account stood against the land, he said. And they're saying the land's sold. I can't run credit on land you don't hold. You understand it's not personal. But it was personal. It's always personal when it's your name and your husband's name and a lie doing the work. She counted out coin for the flour and left the coffee and the oil on the counter and walked out. And she felt every eye in that store on her back. The lie was spreading. That's the thing about a lie put down on paper and stamped by the county. It stops being one man's lie. It becomes the record. The store believed the record. The neighbors half believed it. Even she, in the bad hours before dawn, had to take the flour tin down and read the postmark again, just to know she wasn't the one who was mistaken. But the worst of it, the thing that took the private lie and hung it up in front of the whole town, came on a Sunday. She'd gone to church as she always did. She sat in the Hartwell pew alone and sang the hymns and did not let her face do anything but pray. And when the service let out and the congregation came down the steps into the churchyard, blinking in the light and talking low the way people do after church, somebody stopped by the notice post. There was a handbill nailed to it. New, the ink still black and sharp. Public auction, it said, big at the top, and under it, the particulars. Hartwell Farm, 40 acres. Lot 7. The bottomland described, the north field described. The elm not mentioned, but she knew it was in there, under the words, under Lot 7. Her whole life on that post for anybody to read, listed like a wagon or a plow, going to the highest bidder. People read it. She watched them read it. Neighbors who'd known Thomas his whole life stood in the churchyard and read her land off a post and then looked at her and looked away. Silas Pruitt was there. He came to church, the pious fraud. He walked past her on the path, and he stopped, and he touched the brim of his hat, polite as anything. The county doesn't make mistakes on paper, Mrs. Hartwell, he said. And he walked on. She stood in that churchyard with the whole congregation half watching, and she did not weep. She would not give it to them, and she would not give it to Pruitt. She looked at the handbill one more time, memorized the lot number, Lot 7, and she turned and walked to her wagon with her back straight, and she drove home. But something had changed in her by the time she got there. In the churchyard, the pain of it had been all she could hold. On the wagon road home, mile after mile with the horse's ears bobbing in front of her, the pain cooled and hardened into something else. Into resolve. Pruitt had said the county doesn't make mistakes on paper. Well, she had a paper too. She had a tin full of papers with little dates stamped on them, and one of those dates put Thomas's broken hand in a French hospital on the day this clerk's book said he was sitting at a desk in Ohio signing his farm away. The lie was on paper. The truth was on paper. And papers could be laid side by side and read by anybody with eyes. She just needed somebody who could read the county's paper the way Pruitt read it. Somebody who knew the books. There was a man, old Reuben Tate. He'd been the county recorder for near 40 years before he retired, before Pruitt ever came into the office. He was 70 now, living quiet out past the crossroads with his chickens and his own patch of ground. She'd known him a little, the way you know the old people in a county. He'd kept the land books longer than anyone alive. If there was a man in Cossocton County who could read the truth out of those ledgers, it was Reuben Tate. Her sister's boy, her nephew, a steady young fellow named Wesley, drove her out to Tate's place. She took the flour tin with her, holding it on her lap the whole way like it was a live thing. Reuben Tate was thin and stooped, and his hands shook a little, but his eyes when he looked at you were sharp as a young man's. She sat at his kitchen table and told him the whole of it, and she took the letters out of the tin, and she laid out the deed she'd gotten a copy of from the county. And she watched his old face while he listened. When she was done, he didn't say anything for a while. He got up slow and went to a shelf and came back with his spectacles and put them on, and he took up the deed and held it close to the window light and read it. He read the date. He read the signature. And then he did a thing she didn't expect. He looked at the number. There was a number on the deed, up in the corner. A recording number. She'd taken it for nothing, just bookkeeping. Tate tapped it with a shaking finger. 4,408, he read. He said it slow. Then he looked at her over the spectacles. You said this was entered this year. This spring. That's what he told me. That's the date on it. Tate shook his head, slow, and a strange grim light came into his eyes. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, I set the numbering in that book. Every deed gets the next number in the line, one after another, no skips, no doubling. That's the whole point of it. That's what makes the record a record. He tapped the number again. Entry 4,408 was set down 2 years back. I mind it because I was still in the office when it was entered. It was the Dobbins parcel, out on the Ridge Road. 4408 belongs to the Dobbins family. The room went very quiet. Even the clock on Tate's shelf seemed to hold its tick. You mean, she said slowly, there's 2 entries with the same number. I mean somebody slipped a page into that book, Tate said. Wrote it up to look like it belonged and gave it a number that was already spent. You can't do that, honest. There's no honest way that number lands on this deed. Somebody sat down and forged the whole thing and wasn't careful enough or wasn't smart enough to know the numbering would catch him. He set the deed down on the table like it had gone bad in his hand. And look here. He held it back up to the light and put his old finger just under the signature and the date. The ink. The ink over the date's fresher than a page 2 years old ought to be. It hasn't gone brown the way old ink goes. This paper claims a date it never lived through. Eleanor sat and looked at the deed on the table and felt the whole world tip and settle into a new shape. She had it now. She understood that clear, sitting at Reuben Tate's kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the window. She had all of it in her 2 hands. The postmark that put Thomas's broken hand in France. The ledger number that couldn't be, the same number spent twice, the forged page slipped into the honest book. The ink too fresh for the date it claimed. And if she wanted more, she had Thomas's own signatures, real ones, on the war bond papers they'd signed together before he left, to lay beside the clean, confident forgery and show the world they came from 2 different hands. The county had a paper. She had the truth. And now she had a man who could prove the county's paper was a lie by the county's own rules. "What do I do with it?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. A woman can't just walk into that courthouse and call the clerk a forger. Reuben Tate took off his spectacles and folded them and looked at her a long moment, and something almost like a smile moved in the deep lines of his old face. "No," he said. "But you don't have to call him anything. You let the law call him. You file a petition. You ask the court to void that transfer for fraud, and you ask that the original ledger, the whole bound book, be produced in open court. You don't accuse a soul, you just ask them to bring the book. And you and I both know what the book will show when they lay 4408 open on the table twice." He leaned back in his chair. "The trick, Mrs. Hartwell, is not to let Silas Pruitt know you know. Not yet. Let him think he's won. Let him think you're beaten and clearing off. A man who thinks he's safe doesn't guard his back." She thought about that. She thought about Pruitt touching his hat in the churchyard. The county doesn't make mistakes on paper. Oh, but it had. It had made one bad mistake, and she was going to lay it open on a table in front of the whole county, and she was going to do it so quiet that Silas Pruitt would never see it coming until it fell on him. She gathered the letters back into the tin, careful, one by one, the way she always did. She put the lid on. Wesley drove her home in the dusk, and she held the tin on her lap and watched the dark fields go by. Thomas's fields, Lot 7. And for the first time since the thin man came up the lane, she was not afraid. She knew what she had to do now. She had to ride into the county seat, quiet as a Sunday, and file her petition, and set the machine of the law turning under Silas Pruitt's feet without him ever feeling the ground begin to move. She had to hold her face still for weeks while the men who'd stolen her husband's ground believed they'd gotten away with it. And somewhere across the ocean, in the mud he wrote about, Thomas Hartwell was still alive, still hoping to lie down in the clean north field. She didn't yet know that the cruelest turn of all was still coming down the road toward her, or that when it came, it would hand her the one proof no forger on earth could ever answer. She rode into the county seat on a gray Monday, and she filed her petition, and she did it so quiet that not one soul in the courthouse looked up twice. The clerk who took her papers was young and bored. He stamped the date, filed the copy, and never once thought to wonder why a farm wife would ask the court to compel a bound ledger book into open hearing. Silas Pruitt was 3 doors down, drinking coffee, believing himself a winner. He did not feel the floor begin to move. She held her face still. That was the hardest part. Weeks of it. She passed Pruitt on the church steps and let him tip his hat, and she nodded back the way a beaten woman nods, tired and small. She asked Voss's agent, the heavy man with the pocket watch, for a little more time before Saturday. She asked it soft. She let him tell her the land was sold and there was nothing to be done. And she thanked him for his patience like a woman with no cards left in her hand. Inside, she was building her case one page at a time. She wrote to the field hospital. She wrote to the chaplain whose name Thomas had scratched at the bottom of his last letter. She wrote to the army, plain and short, asking for the record of Private Thomas Hartwell's wounds and the dates of them. The letters went out and the waiting began. Weeks, she learned to live inside the waiting the way she'd learned to live inside the war. The chaplain wrote back first. His hand was careful. He had sat with Thomas the week of that Tuesday, he said. Thomas's right hand had been torn open by shrapnel near the Argonne. It was wrapped in gauze from the wrist to the fingers. The man could not hold a spoon that week, the chaplain wrote, let alone a pen. He signed his name and his rank, and he prayed for her. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low. Then she put it in the flour tin with the rest. She went to the courthouse one more time for the war bond papers. Thomas had signed those before he left, sitting right at the bank counter, and his real signature was there on the stubs. The T of Thomas made the way he always made it, the tail running long and low. She laid the war bond beside the forged deed on Reuben Tate's table. And the old man put his glasses down close and looked from one to the other for a long time. "That's not the same hand," he said. "Look at the R. He never crossed his R like that in his life. And the pressure's wrong. A man signing his own name presses light. This one's traced. You can see where the pen stopped and started. He tapped the deed. A tracer always stops and starts. He can't help it." There was a bad afternoon in there, too. She was in the record room, bent over the old ledgers with Tate, when Silas Pruitt came in through the front. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes went to her and then to the book open in front of her, and something moved behind his face. Eleanor felt her heart go up into her throat and stick there. But Reuben Tate never so much as looked up. "Mrs. Hartwell's tracing a grave plot," he said, "easy as anything. The old Hartwell burying ground, back before your time, Silas, family stones got no date on it. She's trying to find where they entered the plot in the 80s. He turned a page. "You want to help her look? Your eyes are younger than mine." Pruitt did not want to help her look. He said something about the county's time not being for grave hunting, and he took his coffee and he went. Eleanor let out the breath she'd been holding for a full minute. Tate closed the ledger gently and slid it back on its shelf. "He's spooked," Tate said quiet. "But he doesn't know. Spooked and not knowing is the best place we can have him. Come back Thursday. Come in the back." She came in the back. She always came in the back after that. And then the telegram came. It came on a Tuesday, which she would think about for the rest of her life. A boy on a bicycle rode up the lane in the middle of the afternoon, and she was hanging washing again. The same line where the county man had first found her, and she saw the yellow envelope in his hand, and she knew. Every farm wife in the county knew what a yellow envelope meant that year. She wiped her hands on her apron, and she walked to the gate, and she took it, and she signed for it, and the boy rode off fast, the way they always rode off, because none of them could bear to watch a woman open one. She opened it standing right there in the yard. The War Department regretted to inform her. Private Thomas Hartwell had died of his wounds. There was a date. There was a place, an evacuation hospital behind the lines. There was the word regret, which meant nothing, and the word died, which meant everything. She did not cry in the yard. She had not cried in the churchyard, and she did not cry now, not there, not with the wash half hung and the sheets snapping in the wind. She folded the telegram once, and she went into the house, and she sat down in her chair, and she looked at the empty chair across from her, the one she read his letters to, and only then did she put her face down into her hands. She grieved for 3 days. She let herself. She did not touch the case. The letters stayed in the tin, and the tin stayed on the shelf, and she moved through the house like a woman under water. Wesley came and did the chores and did not try to talk to her, which was the kindest thing he could have done, and she was grateful to him for it in a dull, far-off way. On the 4th day she took the telegram down off the mantel, and she read it again, and she saw the thing she had been too torn open to see. The date. The War Department had fixed it in black and white, stamped and official and past all argument. On the deeds Tuesday, the day Thomas Hartwell was supposed to have sat down and signed away his farm for $310. Thomas Hartwell had been lying in an evacuation hospital behind the lines in France, dying of the wounds that would take him. The cruelest paper the government could send her was also the cleanest proof any court could ask for. No forger on earth could answer it. No clerk could trace around it. A dead man's hospital bed does not sign deeds. She sat with that a long while. It felt like a terrible gift. It felt like Thomas, even gone, even under foreign ground, reaching back one last time to hand her the one thing that would save his fields. "All right," she said, out loud, to the empty chair. "All right, Thomas, I've got them now." She did not know that Silas Pruitt had gotten word of the petition. She did not know that a clerk in the circuit court, a friend of his, had whispered to him what Eleanor Hartwell had quietly asked the court to do. She did not know that the ground had at last begun to move under his feet and that he had felt it move. But Reuben Tate knew. The subpoena had come to him too, the order to produce the old bound ledgers in open court. And Tate had done a careful thing. He had moved a cot into the back room of the record office, and he had taken to sleeping there, an old man and his books, because a man who has kept honest ledgers for 40 years knows exactly what a frightened forger will try to do to them. So Reuben Tate was there, in the dark, on the cot behind the shelves. On the night Silas Pruitt let himself in with his own key. Tate heard the door. He heard the soft steps and the scrape of a chair and the strike of a match. He rose up quiet, an old man moving slow so his knees wouldn't pop. And he came around the end of the shelf, and there was Silas Pruitt at the big table with the ledger open in front of him. The ledger. Entry 4408 lying open under the lamp, and a bottle of ink and a fresh nib in his hand, bending over the impossible number to change it before the court could see. "I wouldn't," Tate said. Pruitt came up out of the chair like he'd been shot. The pen went one way, and the ink bottle rocked, and Tate caught it before it spilled, caught it with an old man's steady hand, and set it back down out of Pruitt's reach. "Reuben," Pruitt said. "Reuben, you were only fixing to change a recorded entry in a subpoenaed book. At midnight, by a stolen key," Tate said. "That's what you were only doing. And I saw you do it." He pulled the ledger across the table to his own side, slow and firm. "You've made it worse, Silas. You couldn't help yourself, and you've made it worse. A man tries to forge a deed, that's one crime. A man tries to fix the book after the court's called for it, with a witness watching him do it, that's the crime that hangs him." Pruitt's mouth worked. Nothing came out. He looked at the old man, and the old man looked back. And after a while, Silas Pruitt turned and went out into the dark the way he'd come, and Reuben Tate sat down at the table and did not sleep the rest of the night. He sat there with his hand flat on the ledger, guarding it the way you'd guard something living. The hearing was set for the second week of spring. They came from all over the county. The same faces that had stood in the churchyard and heard the auction handbill read aloud, they filled the gallery of the Coshocton County courtroom now, shoulder to shoulder on the hard benches, hats in their laps. Word had gone around. Everyone knew the Hartwell widow had done something, though few of them could have said quite what. Eleanor sat at the front table in her good dark dress. She had the flour tin beside her. She did not open it. She kept her hands folded on top of it, and she kept her face still, the way she'd kept it still for weeks, and she watched Judge Amos Crandall come in, an old man with heavy brows and a slow way of settling into his chair, and she watched him look out over the room and call it to order. They laid it out one piece at a time. First the deed itself, the forged transfer, entered into evidence and passed up to the bench. Then the letter from the flour tin, the field hospital letter, with its smeared postmark and its date. Then the chaplain's affidavit. Then the war bond papers with Thomas's true signature. Then, last, the telegram from the War Department. And the official death record behind it, with the date stamped and certain. Judge Crandall took the deed page in his two hands, and he turned it toward the tall window on the east wall, and he held it up to the spring light. The whole room watched him do it. He looked at the ink a long moment. "This ink," he said, "to no one and to everyone, is fresh. It has not aged the way a 2-year-old entry ages." He lowered the page. "And this date claims a signing on a Tuesday. The War Department's record shows that on that Tuesday, the man whose name is on this deed was in a hospital bed in France, wounded, and would be dead within the month." He set the deed down flat. A man in a French hospital does not sell a farm in Ohio. The gallery made a low sound, a murmur that ran along the benches, and died. Then they called Reuben Tate. The old recorder came up slow and took the box and was sworn, and he told it plain. He told about the ledger and about entry number 4408 and how that number had been spent 2 years back on the Dobbins parcel, entered in his own hand, and how a number once used in a bound book cannot be used again, not honestly, not ever. Because the book runs in order and the order does not lie. A forged page had been slipped in and given a number that was already taken. He'd staked 40 years on those books, he said, and the books did not make that kind of mistake. Only a man made that kind of mistake. Then he told about the night. He told it the way he'd tell about the weather, flat and true, no heat in it. He told how he'd taken to sleeping in the back room because he knew what was coming. He told how he'd heard the door and the match in the chair. He told how he'd come around the shelf and found Silas Pruitt bent over the open ledger with a fresh pen in his hand and the ink uncapped, changing the number, at midnight, by a stolen key. The whole room turned and looked at Silas Pruitt. Pruitt sat very still at the far table. His hands were on the rail in front of him, and everybody could see them, because everybody was looking now, and the hands that had traced Thomas Hartwell's name onto that deed so careful, stopping and starting, those same hands were shaking now on the wood. He could not make them stop. He gripped the rail to hold them, and it only made it plainer. When they called him, he had to be helped up. He stood in the box, and he tried to make his excuse. "I entered what I was given," he said. His voice came out thin. "The paper came to me. My office records what comes to it. I entered what I was given, that's all. That's a clerk's whole job. I don't." He stopped. He started again. "I don't make the deeds. I only record them." Judge Crandall looked at him for a moment. Then Judge Crandall looked down at his own papers, and he did not answer the excuse at all. He did not argue with it. He simply let it hang there in the room, small and thin, until it seemed to shrink to nothing, and then he said, "Step down," and Silas Pruitt stepped down. And the not answering was worse than any thundering the old judge could have done. Everyone in the room felt it. The excuse had been heard and weighed, and found to be nothing. Then they called Harlan Voss. Voss was a big man, well-fed, in a good coat, and he did not shake the way Pruitt had shaken. He'd bought and sold 100 parcels, and he'd never once sat in a witness box himself, and he plainly thought he wouldn't have to sweat this one either. He folded his hands over his belly, and he said what men like him always say. "I bought that land in good faith," he said. "My company paid for a recorded deed. If there's some irregularity in the county's paperwork, that's the county's affair, not mine. We're a purchaser. We relied on the record. That's the whole of it." The clerk of the court had a paper in his hand. Judge Crandall nodded at him, and the clerk stood, and he read out into the record, plain and slow so the whole gallery could hear it. The price on the transfer. Consideration, the clerk read. $310. The room went quiet in a new way. $310, Judge Crandall repeated, for 40 acres of bottomland along Miller's Fork. He let that sit. This court has heard the same 40 acres appraised at better than $2,000. A man does not sell 40 acres of good bottom for $310, Mr. Voss, not a sane man, not a free man, not a man signing of his own will. He leaned forward a little. "You did not buy in good faith. You bought a farm at a sixth of its worth from a man who was bleeding to death in France, and you did not ask how such a bargain came to your table. A man buying in good faith asks. You did not ask because you knew." Voss opened his mouth. "And here," the judge went on, before Voss could speak, "is your own company's paper." He held up a single sheet. "An order to fence the Hartwell bottomland. Signed by your agent." Dated, he looked at it. Dated while Private Hartwell was still alive overseas and had never signed a thing. Your men were stringing wire across another man's land before the ink on your forged deed was even dry. Your own order damns you, Miss Voss. You didn't wait for the paper. You didn't need to. You already knew it was coming. The murmur in the gallery rose, and the judge let it rise this time. Voss sat there with his hands still folded over his belly. But the folding didn't look easy anymore. It looked like a man holding on. The judge let him step down without another word. Then Judge Amos Crandall gathered his papers and squared them, and the room went still on its own, everybody leaning in, and he read the ruling. He struck the transfer. Every page of it. He struck the entry in the ledger and ordered it marked void and false in the record forever. He restored the 40 acres, free and clear, to the estate of Private Thomas Hartwell to descend to his lawful widow, Eleanor Hartwell. He bound Silas Pruitt over for trial on the charge of forgery and on the charge of tampering with a court-subpoenaed record. He voided every claim of Voss and Meridian root and branch. And he ordered the company's other transfers in the county open to the same scrutiny. And then he set his papers down, and he looked out over the room, over the same faces from the churchyard, and he said the thing that Eleanor would carry with her the rest of her days. "A man's ground," Judge Crandall said, slow and clear, "cannot be signed away by a hand that was bleeding in France. The record is corrected." He struck the bench once. It was done. The clerk carried the restored deed across the room and laid it on the table in front of Eleanor Hartwell. She looked down at it. Her husband's name at the top, the 40 acres, Lot 7, Miller's Fork, given back. She did not weep even then, not in front of them all. She put one hand flat on the deed, and she put the other hand flat on the flour tin beside it, on the letters, and she sat there a moment with the whole county watching, a hand on the paper that gave her the ground, and a hand on the paper that had proved it hers. Then she gathered them both up, careful, one at a time, the way she always did, and she went home. Spring came full to Miller's Fork. 6 months on, the north field lay open and turned and dark. The field Thomas had cleared by hand, stump by stump, in the years before the war. Eleanor stood at the edge of it in the early morning with the dew still down. Her coffee sat cooling on the porch rail behind her, forgotten, because she'd walked out to look at the ground and forgotten to bring it. She did that most mornings now. Walked her ground. Looked at it the way you look at something you nearly lost. The uniform shirt was folded away in the trunk at the foot of the bed. She'd washed it that last time and folded it and put it away, and she did not take it out. The flour tin sat back on its shelf in the kitchen where it had always sat. The letters inside it, and it was a keepsake again now. Only a keepsake. Its work all done. Silas Pruitt sat in the county jail, waiting on his trial. Voss and Meridian's other purchases had begun to unravel one by one. Other widows and other old men filing their own quiet petitions now that the way had been shown them, and the heavy man with the pocket watch did not come around Miller's Fork anymore. He had come once. Near the end of it, before the leaves were full, Voss's agent had driven up the lane with a paper in his hand, and for a moment Eleanor had felt the old cold come back at the sight of a man from the county coming up her lane with a paper. But this paper was a settlement. The company wanted her to sign it, wanted to make her an offer, wanted to buy its way quiet before the other petitions came due. She met him at the gate. She did not ask him up to the porch. "There's a figure we're prepared to name," the agent started. "In consideration of—" "You don't need to name any figure," Eleanor said. He waited. "The court already settled it," she told him. "There's nothing left for you and me to settle. The ground's mine. It was always mine." A judge said so out loud in front of the whole county. She looked at him steady. "You can drive on back and tell whoever sent you that the Hartwell place isn't for sale. It never was." That was the whole trouble. The agent stood a moment. Then he touched his hat, the way Pruitt used to touch his hat, and he got back in his automobile, and he drove down the lane and away, and she watched him go all the way to the county road. And she did not feel the cold anymore. She felt nothing much at all except the sun coming warm on her shoulders. Wesley was out in the north field now with the plow and the mule, her nephew, the steady young fellow who'd driven her to Reuben Tate's place that first day when she didn't yet know that an old man and his ledgers would save everything. He'd asked for no thanks, and she'd given him the thing he'd never asked for. A share in the place and a home on it as long as he wanted one. She watched him lean into the work, the reins over his shoulder, the earth turning up dark and clean behind the blade, and she thought that Thomas would have liked him. Thomas had wanted to come home and lie down in this clean north field. He never got to. But the field was still here, and it was still theirs, and it would still be theirs when Wesley's children walked it. She thought about the little dates on the envelopes. The thing she'd said all those months ago, standing at this same rail. I never thought the little dates on the envelopes would matter. She'd been wrong. They'd mattered more than anything. A man across an ocean, wounded, dying, had licked a stamp, and a clerk's hand somewhere had stamped a date on it, and that small careless thing had reached back across the water and the months and the grave and laid Silas Pruitt low. You never know which small kept thing is going to save you. So you keep them. You keep them all. She went and got her coffee off the rail. It was cold. She drank it anyway, standing there, looking at her ground, her husband's ground, the ground no bleeding hand in France had ever signed away. There's a lesson in it, if you want one, though Eleanor Hartwell was never one for sermons. It's just this. What's taken unjustly never truly stays kept. Not forever. Paper lies, but paper also remembers, and a patient hand and an honest record and one small saved letter can undo the biggest man in the county. The wicked build their whole house on a signature. And a signature can be read. She finished her coffee, she set the cup on the step, and she walked out into the field to be with her ground a while, in the good spring morning, on Miller's Fork, where the wire was down and the fences were her own again, and the earth was turning up clean behind the plow. If a story like this one stirred something in you, tell me, what's the name of your town? The place you'd fight to keep. Leave the name of your city down below. I read every one. She stood there a while longer than she meant to. The coffee was gone, and the cup was empty, and the morning was getting on, but she did not move right away. There was something about the way the light hit the north field at this hour, low and slanted and warm as a hand on your back, that made a person want to hold still inside it. She had not held still in a very long time. Wesley's voice came across the furrows, talking softly to the mule the way the men in this family always had, low and steady, not commanding but asking, the way you talk to something you respect. The mule's ears twitched. The blade kept turning. Eleanor listened to the sound of it, the clean ripping sound of good earth opening. And she thought that there was no sound quite like it in the world. Not a violent sound at all, despite what it was. A sound of beginning. The smell reached her then, the way it always did when the ground first opened in spring. That deep, wet mineral thing that has no name in any language that does a good job of it. Thomas had tried once. Lying in the grass on a Sunday afternoon years and years ago, young. Both of them so young, it was almost a different species of person entirely. He'd said it smelled like the earth reminding you it was here before you and would be here after. She had told him that was the most morbid thing she'd ever heard on a Sunday, and he'd laughed that laugh of his, quiet and delighted. Like he'd been caught at something. She could still hear that laugh, not every day. But on mornings like this one she could hear it clearly, right there in the field, right there between the rows. The deed was inside on the table. She had not put it away yet. She was not sure she wanted to. Not today, not just yet. There was something she still needed from looking at it. From the physical fact of it, the weight of the paper in her hands and the names typed clean and the county seal pressed into the corner. Hers. All of it hers, and no longer a question. She had spent so many nights when it had been a question, when the answer to that question felt like standing at the edge of something you could not see the bottom of, and she did not think she owed anyone the quick forgetting of that. The elm at the fencelin had leafed out almost overnight the way elms do, sudden and full, like they'd been waiting and one morning simply decided the waiting was finished. She used to sit under that elm with Meredith, her daughter, when Meredith was very small. In the hot part of August, when the shade was the only cool thing for miles. Meredith was in Cincinnati now, married, 2 children of her own who had never seen this place except in photographs. Eleanor had written her the week after the courthouse. She had not written about the injunction, or about Silas Pruitt, or about Reuben Tate's particular genius with a filing cabinet. She had written only, "The land is safe. You can bring the children in summer. There is still an elm." She had not heard back yet. But she would. They always came back to the elm. The mule stopped, and Wesley stopped with it and stood looking at something down at the far end of the row. Eleanor shaded her eyes. Some bird, maybe, or a patch of ground that needed reading before the blade went into it. He stood there quiet and considering, her nephew, 23 years old, with his whole life pointed at this soil, and she felt something in her chest that she could not name but that was not grief and not quite joy, and was maybe only the very plain feeling of rightness, of a thing being where it belongs. The sun was up good now. The dew was burning off the lower pasture in that thin, transparent way that makes the grass look lit from underneath, and the creek down in the hollow was catching the light in pieces, bright and quick through the sycamores, and the world was so ordinary and so perfectly itself that it almost hurt to look at it straight. This was the thing Silas Pruitt had tried to take. Not just the acres. Not just the timber rights or the water access or the deed filed under the wrong name in a back drawer. This exact quality of mourning. The specific weight of standing on ground that your people had broken and tended and grieved over and occasionally, on very good days, simply loved without any grief in it at all. You cannot put that in a ledger. You cannot steal it with a signature and expect the theft to hold. She picked up the empty cup from the step. She would go in and make fresh coffee, and she would sit with the deed one more time. Not from worry, only from the plain pleasure of a document that told the truth, and then she would put it somewhere safe and she would stop sitting with it. There would be other things to sit with. Spring always brought them. But first she walked out into the field. Not far, just to the first row, just far enough to feel the turned earth soft under her boots, the dark wet giving of it, the smell rising up close and real now, present as a person. She stood in it for a moment. She looked down the long row toward Wesley and the mule and the bright end of the morning. The wire was down. The fences were hers. The elm had leafed out, and there was still time to bring the children in summer and show them what their family had held on to, and what it had cost, and what it looked like on the other side of the cost. Which was just this. Only this. A woman standing in her own turned earth on a good morning in spring, whole.